People are still joining, but I think I'm going to start now. Otherwise, we have the awkward pause. So just hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of our two-part event series, which is focused on regenerative agriculture, in which we'll explore what the implications might be of corporate engagement in this concept. To introduce myself, I'm Tara Garnett. I'm the director of Table. For those who don't know, Table is a collaboration between the universities of Oxford, Wageningen, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, Cornell, the University of Mexico, and the University of the Andes, and it explores issues and debates around the future of food. So, on to this afternoon's session. As anyone who's joining this event will know, regenerative agriculture has become a real buzzword in recent years. You hear it everywhere, and it's used everywhere, from the most radical of NGOs to the most mainstream of corporate actors. And because of this, what it is still not clearly defined. And if one were to sort of think about the sorts of things that are being said about regenerative agriculture and the different ways of thinking about it, you can see it as one of perhaps three different approaches. For some, it's defined by a set of particular practices. For others, it's linked to specific outcomes around carbon, say, or soils or water or farmer well-being. But for others still, it's a whole new way of being and thinking. In other words, a whole new mindset. And because of these different understandings of what regenerative agriculture is or could or should be, the fact that increasing numbers of corporations are starting to get interested in it is welcomed by some and treated with skepticism and indeed even suspicion by others. So for some people, it's really great that companies are starting to think about new ways of farming that cause less damage to the environment, and perhaps give better returns to farmers, and that this is a way of thinking that and doing that we should all get behind. But for others, the worry is that this corporate involvement dilutes or distorts the essence of what RA is or should be. And so that they're going to ask, how is regenerative agriculture truly regenerative if everything else remains the same, the supply chain, the power structures, and the end products, the instant noodles, the unhealthy snacks, and so forth. So in other words, can you have a regeneratively produced ultra-processed food, or is this just an oxymoron? So that's the question we're going to be exploring in this afternoon's event. And of course, we're going to be looking at things from a much broader perspective than that. But for now, I'd like to welcome four great panelists this afternoon who've all thought deeply about regenerative agriculture and, of course, food systems more broadly. They're Matt Ryan from Nestlé, Melissa Ho from WWF, Sarah Farley from the Rockefeller Foundation, and Jyoti Fernandez from the Land Workers Alliance in the UK, which is affiliated with La Via Campesina, the international movement. I'm not going to spend time introducing them because their full bios are going to be posted in the chat. So we're going to begin with a 2-minute opening statement from each of them, in which each of the panelists articulates very briefly what they think regenerative agriculture could or should be, their best case hopes for it, and how they see this relationship with wider food system concerns. And this will be followed by a panel discussion, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience in the last half hour or so. And when you post your questions, can you please post in the Q&A, not in the chat? I mean, you can use the chat, but just put the questions in the Q&A. And then with the second event that we're holding, we're going to take the discussion where we've left it forward, dig more deeply into areas of disagreement and see where they can be resolved. So that's more or less it from me. But before I hand over to our first speaker, who's Matt, I just wanted to flag up that Jackie, our communications officer, has posted up a Mentimeter poll for you in the chat, all of you, the audience. So you can type in the 3 words that you associate with regenerative agriculture, and then Jackie is going to reveal the results once the panelists have given their 2-minute openers. So, and then the final thing, and then I will just be quiet, is to say that this event is being recorded and will be available to watch if, pass it on to your colleagues in the next couple of days. Right, over to you, Matt. You're on mute.
Off to a good start. Thanks, Tara, and thank you very much to the team at Table for inviting us to this discussion. And I think it's really important that we get a whole bunch of different perspectives on this topic. And I wanted to sort of initially just say that I might stand out a little bit on this panel. I think I'm amongst some very seasoned campaigners on this particular issue, which I'm sure will make much stronger and more articulate points than me. But yeah, I think it's really important that we hear from the ground and from businesses like ours around what we're doing on this particular topic. My background is in sourcing and water resources management initially. So the topics of health and diet aren't really particular strong points for me. So I will do my best to answer where I can, but there might be some particular questions on this that I might need to I might need to pause or address in a different way. So just really briefly, I guess, on Nestle, because I think everyone knows a little bit about the business, but we are pretty big, as you know. We're around 2,000 brands, touching most countries in the world. Around 188 countries you'll find our products in. Most of our products are dependent on agriculture in some way or another. So we owe our existence to hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of farmers all around the world. So from smallholders to the biggest operators, whether that be for cereals in East Anglia, dairy in India, cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire. You know, we have a really big footprint. And I'm not saying for a second that we're perfect, but we are also very risk averse, and we probably don't talk enough about the good things that we're doing as a business. And I think maybe that's been to our detriment at some times as well. So, for example, we've had programs in coffee in Vietnam for almost 15 years, looking at responsible production, sustainability. Closer to home, we've had a milk plan with our fresh milk suppliers, First Milk, which is focused on sustainable production for over 10 years, and is now moving more towards regenerative practices over the last few years as well. So we're not new to this, I guess, even though our targets and our communications about regenerative agriculture have really been in the last few years. So Tara, the question that you raised was more about, well, where do we see regenerative agriculture fitting in with wider food system goals? But I actually think it's wider than the food system. Actually, you know, we've gone past 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So I think the issue, and conventional agriculture has been a major driver to that as well. So I don't actually think we have a choice at the moment to continue with business as usual. I think we need to find a way for all of us to work together to improve the system and the direction that it's going in. Obviously, regenerative agriculture is going to provide opportunities to do that, and potentially opportunities outside of just agriculture itself or environment itself. So there's economic opportunities potentially with less reliance on fossil fuels, less exposure to volatility in those markets, and potentially more agency for farmers and farmer groups to choose their own way, find their own markets as well. So I think it's a really exciting journey that we're on. I think we're very much at an inflection point at the moment where we really do need to see some sort of harmonization across the industry. But yeah, really interested to see where we go in the coming years.
Thanks, Matt. And before I pass on to Melissa, can I just push you on a quick point? Just could you give me either yours or Nestle's definition of what regenerative agriculture is?
Yeah, so I think we see this as an approach to farming that aims to conserve or restore farmland and the ecosystem that it depends on and it thrives in. So delivering benefits to farmers, environment and society. But really it's bringing together a number of different approaches. So whether it be conservation agriculture, precision farming, agroecological principles. So I think it's kind of a middle ground for a lot of these different, I guess, more specific ways of producing food.
Thank you. Melissa.
Great, thank you. And also extend my thanks to you, Tara and Jackie and the team at Table for the space for this conversation and the invitation. I appreciate Matt's comments in building off of Nestle's idea that business as usual is not an option. So Melissa Ho, I lead and support freshwater and food work at the World Wildlife Fund in the US office based in Washington, DC. And for those that don't know WWF or why we care about this issue, we're the world's largest global conservation organization, working in more than 100 countries around the world, and really looking to advance a future in a world where people and nature thrive. And so folks following global discussions these days and knowing, experiencing the hottest record temperatures that the world has faced, and the trends are moving in that direction, it's hard to ignore the essential urgency we've got around climate and trying to adhere to a 1.5 degree future. There's also a lot of discussion on the loss and degradation of nature and biodiversity and the impacts that has on us and our ability to have a healthy future as people. And then also, the Sustainable Development Goals, we very much care deeply about human development and poverty, obesity, hunger, and access to water and things like that through the SDGs. And so we cannot think of positive change on any of these really important fronts that humanity faces without thinking of food systems transformation at a very large, holistic, and non-incremental way. And so it's not only that ag and food systems are the drivers of change, of which they are, and we know the data and the statistics on food systems impacts, but food systems are also being impacted by climate change, and we need adaptation, not only mitigation from ag. We also know that loss of nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services, water, pollinators, etc., food systems will be impacted by the loss of nature. But we also have this opportunity where food systems and ag are really the only sector that has the potential to be part of the solution. And so for WWF, Regen Ag is one of those framings and approaches that can really help create the vision, as well as I love, Tara, your opening that it is practices, it is outcomes, and it is a shift in mindset. And I think the idea is that for us, we need to define it, the systems change we need, and Regen Ag can be a part of it more holistically. So there's impacts on human health and what the food system should deliver. Our people, all people getting access to healthy, nutritious food. Community level livelihoods and economic impacts are important in this dialogue, as well as the planetary health, climate, and nature. And so we define it very broadly in that regard. And I think it is about this opportunity with corporates. The value chain and corporate engagement is so critical. They play such a huge role, but we must also think about that not in isolation of the impacts on the ground in landscapes for the communities, and that we have to think of change starting on the front lines with the producers and the communities who are growing the food, absolutely, in the incentives and making it work for them. And so I think the last thing I'll just mention in my opening, I guess, is that for food systems, I think it's a journey we're on. I think it is practices, it is outcomes, it is the principles and mindset shifts, and we need to have all actors at the table. We very much subscribe to agroecology as a solution potentially as well, and use the frame nature positive. And we are really there's a lot of advent around nature-based solutions. But we need to create the shared vision of what good should look like, regardless of which of these things you subscribe to. And then we need to really define accountability and how we get there together, and that we're not incremental in that shared vision and in how we are being accountable for the future.
Thanks, Melissa. And later on in the discussion, I would like us to discuss this idea of a shared vision of what good looks like beyond the generalities, to see if there are kind of shared ideas that are of substance rather than just of kind of nice words. But that's one for later. Sarah.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to join these fabulous thought leaders and you hosting us at this table debate. And I think between the notion of the planetary boundaries and the broader context that Melissa so beautifully just laid out, the relationship between food systems and the necessity for regeneration has never been clearer, right? It's 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions that is consequentially produced across the entirety of the food system, 75% of freshwater use, 86% of species driven to extinction that are most highly threatened will go there because of the food system. And our food system actually is the #1 cause of preventable death, diet-related diseases. It all comes back to food. So when we look at the leverage points within this food system that is driving so many challenges, both socially, environmentally, and certainly for climate, we see tremendous potential to address both the deforestation, land degradation, carbon emissions, and biodiversity loss that comes from how we produce our food. So I think the question on the table is, what is this shift in production systems? How far out are its boundaries, and how do we consider it sufficient? And that's where we come to the debate on regenerative. Part of some work that we're supporting at the Rockefeller Foundation, where I lead our global portfolio, which is where our regenerative and agroecology portfolio sits, is a network that recently tried to calculate all of the different definitions and measurement frameworks on regeneration and agroecology. Our number hit over 150. So there are many, many unique perspectives, and those are separate from the way Nestle might define it, which is a little bit different from Unilever, which is a little different from Danone. This is confusing. And so what I would offer the conversation is an analogy that I think can help us start to understand the texture between these definitions. The analogy is a swimming pool, shallow end, deep end. In the shallow end, in contrast to conventional agriculture, which is really requiring a direct relationship to the fossil fuel industry through the application of synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, and other inputs, there's a greater focus on both soil health and carbon sequestration. That is exciting. It's a transition, to be sure. It's very hard to get there. It requires all kinds of considerations about where our inputs will come from, production, how these farming systems will work, but it's still really just the shallow end. Until we get to the middle of the swimming pool, there we start to consider a broader suite of environmental outcomes, building back biodiversity, building back water quality, water retention, as well as the GHGs and soil health. However, you could get to the midpoint of the swimming pool and still have your food system running on slave labor. You could still have exploitation of workers. We don't get to deep regeneration until we put people at the very center of this question of what does regenerative food system looks like? And there we consider outcomes like building back the well-being, not just the profitability, the well-being of farmers, their communities, their spiritual traditions, their cultural traditions, equity. So taking this shallow to deep connotation, we're then able to overlay agroecology, which has frankly a much longer head start in terms of movements. It's a wonderful science, clear and adopted principles, the high-level panel of experts on the agroecology principles adopted by over 170 countries. Where we see deep regeneration, we're largely seeing agroecology. Where we see shallow regenerative approaches, we are not talking about agroecology. For Rockefeller, we want to see the incentives and the policies align toward deep regenerative approaches in agroecology, but we also recognize these are not light switches. You can't go from the industrial conventional system to deep regenerative overnight. There is a transition and there's a pathway and there's a bravery for corporates like Nestle that are taking those first steps. But it is a journey, and it is critical that we overcome the many barriers facing corporates, but frankly, more insidiously, facing farmers who, by and large, are being asked to figure this out without any support either from government or corporates. And we need to tackle that as a very explicit barrier that needs to be overcome so that we can take the full systems view, activate the full panoply of financing, policy, coalition building, research, innovation, all the tools that will be needed to do this in a way that is just, that is equitable, and that really delivers across the environmental, the social, and the financial outcome areas that we believe to be possible with regenerative agriculture. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And it would be really interesting to talk more about the barriers. Just on the ultra-processed foods, very specific point, would you say that is at the shallowest end of the swimming pool or not yet in the pool?
This is where it gets really, really thorny, because an analogy I would use, you could have a deep regenerative technique where you're using some of the oldest traditions, you know, the three sisters, maize, squash, legumes. You're doing this in a way that is culturally appropriate. You have dimensions of profitability, etc. You could do all that. But if the purchaser of that maize goes and processes it to corn syrup, which then goes into sugary sweetened beverages, who bears the blame for that, right? Was it the farmer that went and really did this in a beautiful way across environmental and social dimensions, even though the ultimate processing of that food delivers metabolic disease? I think we really have to tease it apart in this conversation, because I would argue that was regenerative production, but we didn't get to a nourishing, regenerative, and equitable outcome.
Mhm.
So there's a question of incentive, there's a question of agency that gets really thorny.
Thanks, Sarah. So, Jyoti, I think this is a good segue into you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me as well. And it's always an honor to speak in things like this, but also on behalf of the 200 million peasant farmers and indigenous people that my organization represents. So yeah, I've worked as a smallholder for many years, but now my job is to work as head of policy for the Land Workers Alliance, which is a union for farmers, foresters, and land-based workers. And we're a part of La Via Campesina, which represents over 200 million small-scale farmers, also family farms, you know, some of them quite big, medium-scale farms as well, indigenous people and peasant farmers all over the world that fight for protecting agroecology, which is, you know, working with a form of agriculture that works with local ecosystems in terms of nutrient cycling, low input to the, you know, to the farming system, soil health, integrating trees and agrobiodiversity, and all those sorts of things that are techniques that are very similar to organic farming, and what regenerative farming would be. In what they're saying is that, you know, shallow definition of it. But we also really integrate into the idea of agroecology that it's got a social dimension that's really important to look at in terms of fair employment and remuneration for farmers, and it really thinks about nutritionally rich food being produced and distributed in an equitable way so that access to healthy, affordable food is there for all people. It's got a cultural identity to it as well. So it's thinking about what's appropriate and nutritionally appropriate for local populations. And it addresses issues about food access and inequality. It addresses issues about loss of jobs, and trying to make sure that there's employment in the sector that's fair and that people are treated fairly. And something that's really important in this debate, and probably the most important consideration that we consider part of agroecology, is looking at corporate control of the food system. When we analyze agroecology and how we think about it, we really look at what corporate control of the food system means in terms of inequality, and how it feeds into a system that ultimately is making it difficult for small-scale farmers, indigenous people, and peasant farmers to be able to have equitable access to land and the resources they need to be able to feed their communities. And when we talk about agroecology, we talk about the agroecological food webs as a methodology for feeding people. And that's not only the production, but it's how it's distributed and how it's consumed. What are the values behind food? And, you know, there's all the production that might be, you know, restoring biodiversity at the same time as it's being produced, looking after soil and sequestering carbon. But we also have to think about it being distributed so that it feeds families and communities in a way that meets their social needs, their cultural needs, and nutrition needs in the best way possible. And we juxtapose that against the industrial food chain, which is a different, you know, way of producing food that's usually very high input, and products are produced as commodities, and they're often distributed in different ways that have to do with marketing through, well, a capitalist framework, a corporate framework. And there's a group called ETC Group, which is a think tank that has looked at the impact of the industrial food chain on environmental damages and calculated that 4 trillion in damages to the ecosystem has been produced by the industrial food chain. Or on the other hand, the agroecological food web has actually regenerated huge amounts of biodiversity, retained agrobiodiversity within popular knowledge, and does a huge amount to sequester carbon in soil and plant trees and integrate all of that within ecosystems. And so the ETC group is where you can go to for that information, but they've also looked at the fact that 30% of global food security is provided by the industrial food chain, using 70% of agricultural resources. So it's actually quite an inefficient way to feed the planet, where conversely, the agroecological food web is providing 70% of global food security using only 30% of global resource because of the resource efficiency embedded in those models of food security. So those are things that are out there. And I think the thing I really want to point out in relation to this debate is that there's actually a competition for resource out there globally. And when I've been at the, climate change talks, for the climate adaptation packages, for the mitigation packages, about the industrial food chain as opposed to ecological food webs. And the lion's share of the money is actually going to the industrial food chain, despite the damage that it causes. But there's things like the baby milk controversy. If you just look at Nestle, for example, there may be good initiatives out there, but there's things like, the aggressive marketing of baby formula that is, has been under controversy for the corporation for years, where mothers are given baby milk, and then, when they leave hospital, they're not given it anymore, but their breast milk is dried up, and then they're dependent on ultra processed baby milk. Or the aggressive marketing. There's a whole army of direct sales, marketing that Nestle deploys across the global south, where 42% of their sales are in the developing world, where they, go to low-income areas, slums, villages, schools, trying to promote ultra-processed food products, which then stops young children and people within those areas from going back to traditional diets and the sort of food that is more nutritionally appropriate within those areas. And it kind of goes alongside this trend to transform local agriculture into cash commodities, into sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, to soya based products, to meat that's based on factory farming models, and getting people more addicted to these sorts of diets, which then there's no longer the smallholder farmers that are producing very diverse agrobiodiverse crops on their small holdings, and which are being consumed within local communities, because there's this dependency on ultra processed foods that are developed by the industrial food chain and really aggressively marketed. And so on one hand, there may be some good projects there, but because of this amount of competition, because of the way that system of aggressive marketing works within the capitalist framework, it's very difficult to justify supporting a transformation of that model. It needs to go back to actually looking at full, food system transformation, and how we really strategically support the growth of agroecological food webs as the way to feed the planet.
Thank you, Jyoti. So I'm going to just try and summarize that. So we've heard that regenerative agriculture could be thought of as a kind of journey, a process. That's something that's often thought about, that at its very best, it could be defined as agroecology, which incorporates the social justice dimension, that it could be seen as part of a suite of different ways of thinking about how we might be able to reconfigure the food system alongside agroecology, but also concepts such as nature positive. And then finally, the argument that production is all good and well, but we can't really talk about good production without considering its relationship with and its contribution to wider system and its outcomes. So I'm going to pause there. This is a ton of questions, but we're going to move on to the big reveal with the Mentimeter. Jackie, are you able to share your screen? So I think it's self-explanatory. It's 4 grounds: agroecology, soil health, diversity, not so much on the social. What we can do is we can include this in a screenshot of that in the outcome of the event, in the recording and all the rest of it. So there you go. So let's move on. So Jyoti and Matt, I'd be keen for you to have a conversation in this particular event. I mean, Jyoti, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'm just wondering whether there is a universe really where the Land Workers Alliance and La Via Campesina would work with Nestle, and on the converse, Matt, to what extent do your interactions with smallholders and as part of your suppliers, to what extent are you taking account of the concerns that Jyoti has raised?
Should I go first, or
Go for it?
Sure. I think I might build on Sarah's swimming pool analogy a bit here, because I really like it. And I think the build, I think, is that we are, I guess, jumping into the shallow end with our floats on it a little bit at the moment. And I kind of see that Jyoti's at the other end of the pool. and I think we need to try and find a way to swim, really, to learn how to swim. And I think eventually, you know, we like I said before, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think business as usual is going to be possible, even, you know, beyond the next sort of time horizon, which is 2030, when we check all of our numbers and you know, everyone's either happy or unhappy about the progress that we've been making. So I think I wouldn't rule it out, to be honest, that there would be a situation in which there is a bit more convergence. And to be honest, Jyoti, I think, you know, amongst the 200 million smallholders that your organization represents, there's probably many thousands that actually supply us already, I would imagine, in terms of whether it's cocoa or dairy in India or something like that. So I think there probably is overlap already. I'm not sure whether that's true or not.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you know, people, you know, farmers often look for markets to try and connect to markets, and smallholder farmers, it's important to find markets for them. I think it's just whether or not you're replacing the markets that you know, are more directly bringing food products to consumers and communities without the ultra processing standing in the way, because there's been a lot of difficulty for small farmers in supplying larger corporations with products, in terms of, you know, and whether this be you know, a dairy farmer trying to supply a supermarket, or a processor that, you know, doesn't give very fair contracts because they're trying to barter down to the lowest price that they can gain from them, or whether it means that, you know, global corporations or companies source from whoever can supply things cheapest to them, and then they don't give security of contract so that they can move from place to place. You know, it might be a cocoa producer in one country, or farmers all gain a dependency on supplying a certain company, and when they figure out that they can source more cheaply in a place that might have environmental standards that are lower, or lower workforce standards, whatever it is, then they'll just yank the contracts from that area and move to another place. And so there's a tremendous amount of volatility there when, you know, smallholders are linked to these insecure markets that corporations often provide. So, you know, it's become a thing that there's actually been a dismantling of the sort of systems that strategically support smallholder farmers to have secure incomes, whether that be protectionist measures or cooperatives that are set up to be able to process and distribute locally, ones that don't rely on ultra processed food and junk food being processed with the products, whether it's sugar or cocoa that they produce. You know, and I think just strategically in wider food system reform, that needs to be thought about better. I mean, it's great that Nestle might be supplying a market for these farmers, but we could have better markets that achieve better outcomes in terms of health and nutrition, and also security of income for farmers.
Yeah, and I think maybe one project that I might want to speak about just quickly on this is some of the work that the business is doing on cocoa at the moment as well, where we're providing, we're increasing income for cocoa farmers to support not just, you know, agricultural transition and agroforestry, but also to support their families and children as well. So this is a program which is an incentive for providing training and support, not just for good agricultural practices, so pruning cocoa trees and stuff like this, but also the bulk of the incentive is actually around child protection as well. So financial incentives to families for ensuring that children between 6 and 16 are enrolled in school. And that's obviously paid at the start of the year when it's needed the most by those families as well. Another part of that goes towards diversification of the family businesses as well, because, you know, again, we don't necessarily want these families to be locked in and having cocoa as the only source of revenue and actually a direct tie to us. So there is money available for diversification of businesses. And actually, I think one of the most interesting thing is half of the payment of this will go to the other half of the family. So the male in the family will get half, and the woman will get the other half as well, just to make sure that there is a split, because I think it's quite important to make sure that the women in the family have an income of their own as well. So we're at the moment, that's at about 10,000 families in the Ivory Coast, and by 2030 we're hoping that that's a global initiative. But cocoa is an interesting one, because anyone who knows anything about emission factors and things like this will know that the deforestation challenge that there's been in West Africa has meant that the embedded emissions for cocoa from that part of the world are actually very high. So a business could have made a decision to say, well, actually, we will take our cocoa production to South America, where the embedded deforestation is not as severe. But of course, we'll have millions of families in that particular region that would be without a contract for the cocoa. So I think there is more nuance to this for sure. But we're doing our best, particularly in those particularly fragile situations, to make sure that there is additional income to make farming attractive in the future as well.
Thank you. Would anyone, Melissa, Sarah, would you like to chip in here at all?
Yeah, and I want to pull the shared vision comment I made at the beginning to the comments that were made so far by Jyoti and Matthew. Really rich discussion. I think the idea that there are existential challenges that we've been talking about, as well as where and how sometimes we're talking past each other in terms of addressing them, and where regen ag fits in. So again, at WWF, I think some of the issues that have been raised around, are these even the right crops to be growing, and at what scale, sort of monocultures and driving industrialization of monocultures versus allowing for the inherent biodiversity and agroecological diversity of local diets, and where displacement of foods that often are ultra processed, sort of tend to source and drive more consumption of monocultural type crops, because those are the ingredients that are going into these mass-produced foods. So those are things that should be part of the discussion on what is regenerative ag, as well. So the sourcing also, is this the right environment to grow? Not just did these practices get adopted, but is this even the right place to be growing those things, let alone are these the right crops? And so others have really raised this. And I think some of the trends, when we also holistically define the outcomes we want from a food system, we understand profit and viability of the economics across the entire value chain, and including of multinational companies, but starting with the farmers is important. I think this idea of making sure food systems deliver human health, which we know right now, when a quarter of the population is undernutritioned and food insecure, and then we have, another 30–40%, we see the trends in obesity. And as Sarah noted at the beginning, that now food itself and what we're eating is the largest source of our own health demise and mortality. And a lot of that is linked to the kinds of food that are coming out of our food system. And so just in the US alone, the trends over the last few decades, almost 3/4 of our calories are coming from ultra processed foods. And these trends have been rising globally. And that these foods are also cheaper and more affordable, which is huge implications for access. And then there's more and more interesting studies showing the link to environmental demise. And as I said, often, so I will also there was a question in the chat. I don't want to demonize all of processing or even all of ultra processed foods. There is a role. Processing can be anything from canning, right, to yogurt to, but there is a catalog, and I'm not a nutritionist. WWF is not a nutrition organization, but there is a body of literature that we are studying and partnering with other organizations like the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and nutrition experts that do catalog and classify the kinds of transformations in food to group them as sort of group 1, which is unprocessed, minimally processed, group 2, processed with culinary ingredients, group 3, which are processed foods, and group 4, which is this ultra processed foods. And imagine ultra processed foods are basically things that you could not do in your own home kitchen. There are not ingredients that are found in the stores and supermarkets that you could do yourself. These things you can't pronounce, these compounds that are, manufactured, and then these techniques and manufacturing techniques that are not things you could do yourself. And so those are the category of foods. And again, not all of them are bad, from granola bars to gummy worms. I think the idea is that often, so these are generalizations, but I don't mean to say for all ultra processed foods, but often ultra processed foods that are driving the calorie intake right now, they're cheaper. They often have little nutritive value. They often promote overconsumption, and there is a body of research showing their addictive behavior because your body does not process the nutrients in the same way. They have been shown to displace local diets, and this is the trends we see globally with often not good health outcomes. And it has driven a dependency on monocultures. So soy, corn, certain ingredients that go into their manufacture, which again is driving down the agrobiodiversity inherent in the world. So these are things and trends, and then there's implications on climate and nature, on consumption, on health, and on livelihood. So I think these are some of the issues that should be part of the regen ag, and I love Sarah's analogy to the swimming pool, the deep regen ag, rather than just how it's being used now is, did that commodity get produced in a certain way, and can we call it regenerative? And so I think that's what the heart is of the discussion, and sometimes we're talking past each other. And the last thing, I know I've spoke for a long time and I apologize, but the last thing I'll just throw out there is that I think we really, if we know we are reaching limits to planetary boundaries, and to Jyoti's point, we have finite resources going to support this transition, do we even need to really define what is food versus what is a luxury item? And like, food security should be food inherently delivering nutrition and delivering the shared goals and values that we talked about. And then certain other things that companies, sell and manufacture. We have lots of luxury goods and lots of items, but we are conflating them often in terms of driving food security and production. And then I think that Jyoti's point is really the limited resources we have to support the transition for basic human welfare and planetary health. We need to make sure those resources are really targeted well and really going towards the collective humanitarian good that we need, rather than just driving additional profit for companies for these additional items that, we all enjoy, we all eat, we shouldn't be stopped from doing so, but they may not be as worthy of the need of support for the transition that we really need to have. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Just a quick heads up that Table's already got one of our explainers focused on ultra processed foods. We're doing quite a lot more work there. And Melissa, you've given me a really good idea for an event we might want to run, which on the title of What is Food? But that's to be parked for later. Sarah, you highlighted barriers. I think there is an agreement, and I think amongst all of us, actually, that this kind of deep regeneration is the way to go. But obviously, if it was so easy, we'd have got there already. So perhaps you can speak to some of the barriers and maybe even some ways through them.
Perfect. And actually building off where Melissa took us, because I think the question in that beautiful summary you just gave, Melissa, is like, why is the system giving us what it's giving us? Why is it optimized for unhealthy foods? Why is it optimized for monoculture? And there's a long history that can explain that. But I think it's important in talking about one of the first barriers, money. Money is a barrier. So let's talk about where the money is and what this transition will cost. And I'm excited to say what I'm going to share with you is fresh. This was just launched at COP, 24 philanthropies, asking what a transition strategy, a joined up theory of transformation could look like for regenerative agroecological transition, went into the kitchen to do an analysis of where's the money and what's this going to cost. So our analysis, which, you know, is really sobering because frankly, the data is so thin on even livestock transitions, we didn't feel comfortable baking this in. So I'm going to give you a number that doesn't include livestock. 250 billion to 430 billion a year for at least 10 years to go on this transition to regenerative. And frankly, the analysis has a lot of caveats because it probably wouldn't even get you to deep regenerative. That would get you somewhere to the middle of the swimming pool. So we're talking about 4.3 trillion. That is tremendous. How much money are we putting in now? Our calculations found we're at about 44 billion a year. It's going to regenerative. Frankly, that was more than I thought, right? So we're not at square one. We are taking some steps, but we need at least a 10x increase from philanthropy, from private investment, from corporations, and from government. So that brings me to the second barrier, which is we have north of $650 billion a year going to food and agriculture subsidies. So we could cover the transition, right? That's way more than the 430. More than half of that is providing a perverse incentive. It's literally locking in, pushing with all its might against everything we're talking about here, the shallow, let alone the deep. So there's a massive policy advocacy reform. We talk about repurposing subsidies, and I think we really need to understand what that will entail and how to undertake that as a journey. I think there's a third piece, which is we don't have the deep research and evidence as to what this looks like. And I will say a big asterisk there. There is so much rich traditional ecological knowledge held by Indigenous and other communities, which has not been brought and recognized by, quote, mainstream. So there is so much wisdom there, but we need to be looking at that wisdom, and we need to be looking at the relationship between practices and this rainbow of deep regenerative outcomes. So when we seriously undertake that, I think we'll find the inordinate number of research questions about the relationships between very specific practices, a rainbow of outcomes in all the agroecological zones and market orientations in the world, right? This is a galaxy of data, which poses another barrier, which is what is the data layer that is useful for farmers to make decisions, for investors to make choices, and for governments to make choices. We are missing that. I think a fifth is the radical inclusion. You talked about mindset, and Jyoti gave some wonderful examples of how the dominant capitalistic sort of corporate orientation blinds us both to certain actors that are so critical in this transition, certain knowledge and rights holders that have been excluded, and what it means to work in deep, deep partnership together. I'll say as Rockefeller, we've been working on the formation of this very broad network of networks with farmers, Indigenous people, science, and business called Regen 10. And it's proving difficult, right? That there's so much lack of trust between these different constituencies. But I think it is the table that together and only together, we really do need to create. And until we do that, we don't really understand the objectives, the deepest felt needs of the smallholder farmer versus the large farmer versus the Indigenous community versus the business. We need spaces where we can work through all of that together. And the last I'd like to recognize is lack of landscape level proof points. I mean, nothing is more powerful than examples. There are examples out there, and I have learned so much myself just in the last year about incredible groups from, Common Land, 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people, and many, many others that show us, such as in Andhra Pradesh and the community managed natural farming, what it looks like when you see simultaneous needles for the financial returns, the returns to nature, the social returns, all moving directionally and in correlation. They do exist, but we don't have enough of them. We're not celebrating them. And the last, you asked me about barriers, but I do just want to throw up a little flag because it's already coming out in this discussion and sort of hearing and trying to connect the comments from each of the speakers. There are different spatial scales at which the conversation of transition needs to be teased out. There is a transition at a farm level. There's a transition at landscape level where it's multiple farms. Nestle might be in that landscape together with 10 other large off-takers. There might be a river, a protected wildlife area. So this spatial scale of landscapes for transition to a regenerative set of outcomes is distinct and related. And then there's the whole of food systems and national boundaries, right? So when we're talking about barriers, those barriers are expressed differently at those three spatial levels. I'll stop there.
Can I just come in there, Tara? Is that okay?
Please do, yes.
We didn't practice this earlier, Sarah, but yeah, I just wanted to give an example of us, a project that we've got underway that's trying to do exactly that actually at the moment in Europe. So it's called Landscape Enterprise Networks. It's essentially a mechanism to try and get as many businesses around the table. So it's not just big businesses. We're talking water companies, we're talking local authorities, NGOs around the table to align on, I guess, a coherent ask that goes out to farmers within those landscapes. So rather than it being ourselves and Danone and Unilever coming in with these slight differences in definition and requirements, the idea is that the organization would put together a coherent message for farmers within those landscapes. So that means that we're not just focusing on the cash crop. We could be focusing on, as you say, the river that flows through those farms. It could be on the woodland, the ancient woodland, which needs some preservation, or habitat corridors between the woodland and the riparian buffer on the river. So we're trying. This has been running in the UK for nearly 3 years. It's now expanding into Europe as well, and we're hopefully working on one for North America in this year as well. But that is an approach where we're trying to give the farmers and the landowners as much agency as we possibly can by not stipulating price. Where we're trying to say, well, this is an indication of what we would like you to deliver to us. What does it mean to you? What would this what would you need to deliver these sorts of actions on our behalf? So there's the coherent ask in terms of the practices that we'll be supporting, but also we offer kind of a blank page to say, well, come to us with some innovative ideas. If you want to develop a farm cluster, or if you want to have a collective purchase of machinery or a composting system or something like this, we will look at every single one of those proposals as well. So this is another novel idea which is working at a whole landscape right now, and we're hoping to scale this up with other businesses in the future as well. So
Thanks, Matt. Could you just repeat the name of the initiative? Somebody in the chat asked.
Yeah, the acronym is LENS, so Landscape Enterprise Networks. So there's a bit of information on the internet, but I think the website is in need of update. So I'm happy to take any more questions later. Come up.
Thank you. We actually do have a lot of questions now, and I'm keen to move on to them, but I would just like to ask one more question. Perhaps somebody could respond to this. We've talked about the transformation needed in production. Sarah has talked about the kind of the policy and I guess finance orientation needs. What we haven't talked about are people, citizens, consumers, whatever you'd like to call them, and the fact that the food provisioning, the types of foods, the ways of eating, the food ways, if you like, it implied by this sort of deep regenerative vision is going to be very, very different from the sorts of foods that people eat today and apparently want to eat today. And we have to get into lots and lots of discussions about what people want, what people are given, what people are told they want, what people are, etc., etc. But either way, it's not going to be easy. And so I'm just wondering how if somebody could look at how that particular barrier might be addressed, and then we'll move on to the other questions.
I can tell you one perspective from Rockefeller when we were considering for a regenerative transition. What are the most powerful leverage points? The reason we didn't start with a consumer-facing strategy was because the cards are stacked against the consumer right now. I think it is not accurate to suggest that the choices consumers make are fully in their own control. They've been manipulated by advertisement, if not lied to. They're not getting accurate understanding. Melissa was speaking to some of the complexities on just the science of the measurement of healthy diet, which is actually another area that I've been leading at the Rockefeller Foundation. I can tell you, it is completely dizzying, the complex galaxy of acronyms and measurement instruments on healthy diets, which aren't aligned between institutions. And so not only even from a scientific perspective, are we not yet clear how to map and measure a healthy diet. What we're sold when we go into the grocery store in particular, and so in a retail environment, is incredibly disorienting. And then when you layer that through where our federal subsidies are making certain unhealthy foods, to all of Melissa's great points, cheaper, disproportionately cheaper. And where I think there's a real opportunity here and why repurposing subsidies is so important. If we don't repurpose subsidies, we actually know the price tag. You mentioned the 4 trillion, GOT, the numbers I look at are 12 trillion. 12 trillion is the cost per year. That's every single year. That is the cost of the toll of our global food system on our bodies, on our environment, on the loss of biodiversity, the human exploitation, lack of health insurance for workers, et cetera. So it's not that we're not paying this. The complexity here is a wrong pocket problem. The Ministry of Health is paying for a lot of that. The Ministry of, coordinating labor is paying for that. It doesn't all sit within a Ministry of Food and Ag. And so I think there's a governance issue. There's a policy and subsidy repurposing dimension if you want to get to consumers. That said, I think we could have tremendous success starting to build that wiring in and build the demand pull from consumers. And we love learning about those efforts that others might be leaning into.
Can I just add to that? I so associate myself with Sarah's remarks on the need to really look at fundamental public sector investments in terms of farm support, the subsidies, and the impacts they have, not just on production, but on the food environment and the consumption side. So we very much agree with that. It's very politically charged, it's very complicated, and really unpacking, again, creating the shared vision for what we want our food system to achieve across dimensions of multiple ministries, I think is what is needed. And Rockefeller, let me just shout out to them, in addition to many organizations, including them looking at the repurposing subsidies. WWF is also in that coalition. There's also the evaluating true cost of food and really thinking about looking at the externality pieces that she mentioned as well, and then using that in decision making on the front end. I think the other piece I wanted to mention, of course, now I think the other component that I wanted to mention on the consumer side is I think the food sector is decades behind the energy sector, at least in the climate discussions on where we are with what change needs to happen, and then where and how the campaigns of big oil, and in this case, sometimes big ag, are shifting the responsibility and where the money flows are to the consumers, right? So yes, wow, we should use renewables in our energy, but when you don't have the choices and we have such an industry subsidized and dependent on fossil fuels, it's really hard for the consumers to shift. And so a lot of evidence and a lot of really great literature out there from not just climate scientists, but climate communicators are showing how there's been active engagement with consumers to make it all about our individual choices, and it's our fault, our issues. It's the guilt and the responsibility to totally subvert the responsibility of where the money and where the choices really are being made. And that has some similarities, not all, but some similarities to food, where, wow, I should feel guilty for eating meat or not eating meat, which meat should not be demonized in and of itself as the problem, right? And so I feel like we need to address our consumption on the energy side and on the food side, but we shouldn't oversimplify what choices consumers have in the environment they're faced, and really where the dimensions are chosen for them way before they even enter a supermarket or go to a farmer's market or anything. So I think we in the food sector need to get much more sophisticated and really look and learn from the energy sector to catch up.
Thanks, Melissa. So I'd now like to move on to the audience questions, and there are lots of them. We won't get to all of them, but in a sense, that's okay, because we can use some of them as starting points for continuing our discussion on February the 7th. But I would like to bring in this one, which from an anonymous person, which continues this focus on diet. So the question here posed is, key to making agroecological farming practices work at scale is dietary change, brackets, eating less, especially when it comes to animal source foods. Given that this may well mean lower sales, how likely are corporates to actively support this form of more radical transition? Matt, that seems like one for you.
Yeah, look, I think that the less and better is something that is widely sort of acknowledged across the whole industry, really. We don't sell too much in the way of meat and animal products, but certainly from a dairy perspective, you know, we're always looking to see what we can do to reformulate our portfolio as well, so that we are less intensive on those particular products. But no, look, I don't really have a clear answer for that one, to be honest, Tara. It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I don't know if anyone else has got a particularly clear one on that.
Does anyone want to have a go at that question?
I mean, I know certainly we're very much in all the studies that we kind of support as an organization. There's a huge reduction in the use of animal products, and we were looking at what we felt like. We recently did a study called Soy No More, which is about trying to get rid of soya in the supply chain in the UK because of the impacts of soya being grown in areas that used to be rainforest. So there's a land use change impact there. And we looked at, you know, how much we'd need to reduce by if we were only going to use co-products, byproducts, and waste products of other crops that were being grown for human consumption without, you know, the food feed trade-off. And it was like an 86% reduction in pork and poultry that needed to happen, leaving only 14% of you know, producers, you know, producing pork and poultry if we, you know, went through that lens when we were modeling. And we tried to look at how much of that, you know, how that would impact agroecological producers. And the 86% reduction was actually thinking about eliminating these vertically integrated chicken farms. It was mostly the corporate controlled factory farm sector that needed to go. And it was pretty clear to show, because, you know, that would still be livelihoods for the small scale agroecological livestock stock producers doing that 14%. But really, you know, the majority of the meat that was actually using all of this soya that was imported from rainforest areas was going into factory farms that were corporate controlled. And so it really showed that I think it would be quite difficult to change that sector. That really needs to eliminate the factory farming sector and the corporate control in that sector.
Thank you. I have another question, and this one is from Lydia Cabral. She writes, social justice in agroecology also refers to knowledge systems that challenge hierarchical and top-down innovation processes and that value experience. Can the panel speak to the issue of the politics of knowledge in approaches to sustainability? Anyone want to have a go? Sarah.
I'm guessing she must be familiar with the study called The Politics of Knowledge on this very topic that was put forward by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, of which we're a member. And it, you know, it will give a far more eloquent treatment to this incredibly important question. But I think for all of us, you know, coming from philanthropy, where there is so much privilege and there is so much power, it's a really important critical reminder that we come with biases. All knowledge is situated. All knowledge has a bias and a context and a root. And if we're really, I think particularly because so much of this new word, regenerative agriculture, has this thousands years tail of traditional ecological knowledge, we've so failed on this agenda generally in food systems of radical inclusion. Like, we're just not anywhere near to getting it right. And I think this is part of the reticence some institutions and individuals have towards regen. This is the flavor of the month. How real is this? Next week, it's going to be something different. We're still not getting into the deepest issues, which are about power and control. Is this a serious agenda, or is it going to give lip service? I mean, I'm reading that into that question, and I've heard that incredibly potent critique. And for my own hope, we're serious about deep regen. If we're thoughtful and studious about all the knowledge generated through the agroecology movement, and if we're finally humble and inclusive about traditional ecological knowledge, we finally have the broad table that we've never created before to think about food systems transformation. Frankly, not to think about any type of systems transformation. And from that place, can we not imagine an ability to combine knowledge types and evidence types to answer the questions that none of us have the answer to? We need each other. I feel actually the necessity for collaboration to do this in a way that is nourishing, regenerative, just, and equitable raises the highest standard of collaboration and inclusion that we've ever needed to hold ourselves to. And I hope we can meet this moment.
So thank you. I would be really keen to hear, just to kind of push that question a bit more, of practical examples that anybody else can think of where this kind of inclusive, multiplicitous way of thinking about knowledge is actually happening and achieving things. Matt, you were talking about your Lens project.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also, I mentioned earlier, just when we were talking about definitions, because I think, yeah, I mean, that it's kind of taking, my understanding of regen is it's kind of taking some of the best bits of what we've got already. And I think, you know, we shouldn't shun innovation. I think we should be looking to see how science and technology and you know, research and development can help to drive this along. But, you know, with full respect to the knowledge of the stewards of the land at the same time as well. And that's really the bit that we're at the moment, particularly with this program, where we are supporting farm clusters. You know, we're asking them for advice on what we should be funding and the sorts of practices we should be supporting, rather than us having a top-down approach, because yeah, we're not going to get anywhere if we're prescribing things in this space. So I think it really does have to be a shared experience on both sides of this.
Jyoti, do you have any examples that you might want to flag up?
Well, there's a lot of knowledge that's generated daily by peasant farmers around the world that I would consider the best innovators on the planet. You know, they innovate on 2.1 million varieties of seeds, where, you know, the industrial food chain in general, which gets most of the research and development money, focuses on 137 different crops, with almost half of the budget going to maize for research and development. So, you know, there's a huge amount of innovation that's happening that's unsupported, and it's actually open source, largely crops that can be saved from season to season. And that's very different from the patented kind of gene edited crops that, you know, multinational profit goes to kind of pay back the patents, but then to generate profit for the, you know, to those companies. So yeah, in a way, it's.
Jyoti, we're losing you a bit.
Oh, the kind of innovation that needs to happen is really the sharing across the planet of the kind of knowledge that's open source. And I think that needs to be systematized. It needs to be strategically supported. You know, La Vie Campesina, the organizations transition plan or climate adaptation plan that's actually led from the grassroots, from innovators on the ground across all the different continents, looking at ways to adapt to climate change. And that is with seeds and livestock breeds, looking after soil, looking at agroforestry systems, but also thinking about how we resettle the, you know, billions of climate refugees that are anticipated because of global warming. You know, there's going to be uninhabitable parts of the planet. And so thinking about where those people can be resettled back onto land and, you know, what that looks like. And trying to leverage money for that will be incredibly important from the climate adaptation packages. What I see now, as I've spent a lot of time in the Committee on Food Security and in the climate change talks, and the civil society mechanism is there as the part of the Committee on Food Security, but there's also the private sector mechanism, which is represented on equal footing. And what that means is, Nestle, Archer's Daniels, Midland, Coca-Cola, all of them actually have seats at the Committee on Food Security with little signs and able to, talk about what they do to contribute to global food security, and they're placed on equal footing with farmers and pastoralists and small scale fishermen and people that are actually producing the food, plus the global rights holders, who are all the people who consume food, and that is a really difficult way to make policy, because it means that a lot of the things that are put forward, all the amazing programs that some of these corporations run, like the ones you're talking about that Nestle runs, and almost all corporations have some good programs that they're doing, they're put forward, and it tends to greenwash the other things that the corporations are doing on the other hand, that are actually dismantling a livable planet, that are causing so much health and nutrition deficiencies. And there's a kind of lens that's there about public-private partnership that governments are really buying into, where they say, okay, well, when we invest in economies, we're doing public-private partnerships, and so they work with the corporations in order to invest in food security in these countries. And that makes it really difficult when people are saying, well, actually, on the other hand, they're dismantling the systems that are actually really sustainable ways of producing food and distributing food that meet food and nutrition goals. It makes it very difficult to argue against this, because the greenwash shines so so bright, and because they're usually paid lobbyists, and we're often volunteers and people that are active farmers trying to represent what we're doing in these kind of forums. And so there's a really unlevel playing field, and it's becoming even more unlevel when we look at carbon markets and what's happening with so much of the net zero that's being achieved by companies, by governments trying to meet their mitigation goals through trying to pay for carbon markets and different things. There's a lot of competition there for the land that's being used for the planting of trees or whatever it is to support carbon markets. And we're quite concerned more corporations and governments trying to meet their goals of mitigation, if they start paying farmers, big regen ag farmers, for example, for having loads of grassland that sequesters carbon, that's actually another subsidy that's supporting larger farmers and supporting the industrial food chain rather than smaller farmers, because it'll probably
Jyoti,
I'll stop now.
You keep coming and going, which is frustrating, because you've got lots of really interesting things to say. What I am
okay, I'll stop.
Is that greenwash and carbon markets are two really important issues that we probably can't discuss in the last 15 minutes. But what we're going to do is earmark them for a more detailed discussion at the next session. I'd like to move on to, I guess it's quite a practical question from Rupert Lee, who asks, fair and secure contracts were briefly touched upon. My question, what could be implemented as far as how transparency can be achieved that would shift the balance for farmers and producers for a fair price for a fair supply? So it's about transparency and fair prices and a shift in the balance of power. Who'd like to have a go about the role of transparency? Melissa, you're still on mute for some reason. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. I double muted. Sorry. I want to quickly answer. I'm looking for the question, so I wanted to see the exact wording. But anyway, I think we really at WWF have been trying to have traceability and transparency embedded in supply chains. And often as a conservation organization, we've been coming at it from the stick approach, right? Where we want to ensure there's not deforestation or conversion, whether legal or illegal, where we really want to ensure the accountability in the supply chains. I think the more that we speak and hear from producers directly, and these are not mutually exclusive at all, but we also need to think about the carrot aspect and really where traceability and transparency rewards and lifts up the producers who are doing the good work and are already responsible in the environment and in the systems that they are using. And so they should be and have nothing to hide, and if anything, want their work to be promoted and are very proud of the production systems they have. Often, though, the burden and the onerous of these systems and data systems are on them to implement and use them, and then also the cost and rewards are not there. And so I think we really need to be looking at systems that drive more adoption and send signals from the market, and that the market players, both public and private, reward the good producers and use it more as a way to lift up and show what good looks like, and have a pull in the producer side, but not just make it an onerous and a burden on the producers to say, here's all the now level of things that you need to achieve in order to access this market. So we just need to flip the way we think about these, and then we really need to think through the economics of these systems, not just the technicality of what data systems and what metrics we need, et cetera. And I think we're getting there in certain places, but I still think, and then obviously considering data privacy, data sovereignty, and all of these things, because often we are mining that from the producers, and they're not ever clear what value and what the use of that data is, and of benefit back to them. And that should be first and foremost in the design of any system as well.
Matt, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just really briefly, I mean, we talk about regenerative agriculture as a transition, and typically that transition does not take place over 1 or 2 years. So it's only fair, I think, that you know, if we're asking producers to embark on a transition, that they're rewarded with a longer term contract, I suppose, as well. So that's something that we're certainly looking at for certain commodities. And again, I mentioned the example of cocoa before. It's very similar with coffee and with other things that we're purchasing as well. So yeah, I mean, it's really important, I think, that there's equity in the system, and certainly transparency is one of the things that will really drive that.
Thank you. There's a question from Lasse Brun, who follows on from Jyoti's point on farmer protection on the ground. Looking at the multilateral space, would a change of the narrative be helpful in terms of shifting policy? Specifically, should food sovereignty always be mentioned when addressing nutrition security? And what would be the best long-term approach for LDCs to address food colonialism? I mean, that sounds like it's for you, but other people might want to chip in. Not a small question.
That's a huge question. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I think food sovereignty is the better way to try and address food security needs, because we've seen by using just the food security model on its own, you get so many distortions in, looking at bulk calories that could be produced through the industrial food chain, and not really address nutrition security needs. So if we look at from a food sovereignty framework, we're narrowing it down a little bit so that we can try and define what we really want out of the food system. Yeah, it's a huge question. I don't know all the policies that we can try and defend, but I think it's important to mention in here, and I keep thinking it throughout this, is that there used to be systems which looked at the right to food that were centered around the right to food policies. And many of those were using policies that had to do with trade rules.
What do you mean by systems, Jyoti? Could you clarify?
Political systems. So I think one thing I was doing like a political training on this the other day to food citizens here in the UK interested in thinking about it, which is that when governments took more seriously the right to food, they were enabled to have a package of policies that ranged from things like trade rules, a tariff system, market regulation of pricing, grain reserves, whatever it is that they would put together, and things that, limited marketing of certain products, etc., that were much more heavy state, I suppose, in some ways, but it was there to protect the right to food. And they, as a package, this full range of policies protected farmer incomes, was meant to protect farmer incomes, and also protect everybody's right to equitable access to healthy, affordable, well-produced food. Now, times have moved on, and what that means is even more stark, because there's the whole environmental crisis to take into account, so we don't want to encourage intensive production. But, that kind of central land use planning plus a trade framework that supports it and everything else is something that governments used to take more seriously. And now, because of the World Trade Organization dismantling the ability to have, trade rules that look at the environment first, or food and nutrition needs first, or farmer livelihoods first, because all the seed laws that are put into place, dismantle regulation. It's difficult to try and get regulation of corporations or advertising or those kinds of things because of this rise of liberalism and the neoliberal marketplace. And, the idea that we should be providing for the right to food through the market first before looking at state protections and decent policies, that's really caused tremendous problems in being able to try and fix the food system. And and many of those laws have worked against small producers. The trade rules that allow floods of cheap imports produced to very low standards undercut prices for farmers that are trying to do the right thing. And that's something that consumers have a very little say in being able to stop because of the rise of the World Trade Organization, etc. And so I think we need to think back to how we overhaul all of those international frameworks and systems so that we look at a rights-based framework first.
Thanks, Jyoti. And I think this speaks to the question that somebody has highlighted as important, but maybe for next time, which is on the question of visions and whether everyone on this Zoom actually aligns on a shared vision, because I suspect there will be important nuances when it comes to sort of what they are. I've got one really good question here from another anonymous attendee. And I think this is probably the last question before we do the kind of closing. If each panelist could have one question answered about regenerative agriculture to advance their work, what would it be? You probably need a bit of time to think for that. Got lots of questions, but.
Is that, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Actually, I'm just trying to process, like, if there's something
it could be a research question that could be answered about regenerative agriculture. I'm defining it as a research question. If you could have one question answered about regenerative agriculture that would help advance your work, what would it be?
Gosh, there's more than one.
Well, go just throw us a handful.
I'll kick off one. I think we are desperate to understand what is the most powerful and consequential evidence needed to unlock some of the subsidies that otherwise could be used to fortify the momentum, accelerate the transition to regenerative. Do we need to show the returns? Because we're seeing them, the financial returns. Do we need to show the GHGs? Do we need to show the biodiversity? What is the most critical question? Let's just start with the US and EU that needs to be proved out to make that a politically viable consideration to repurpose subsidies.
I'll jump in on a more science technical question, but it links to thinking of behavior change and shifts in policy and even economic incentives. I think we have a lot of talk of identified practices in specific systems, right? Again, no one size fits all for any system in different environments and geographies. And definitely when you have different production systems, those practices may or may not work anywhere. So I think, but at the same time, Regen Ag, at least in the US, there is a sort of suite of practices and some conventional systems and crops that people sort of check the box and say, I'm regenerative if these 3 or 4 or 5 things are adopted. But I think what we really need to hang our hat on policy change and economic incentives is the link to impacts. and it's very elusive and challenging. And again, I know everyone, Jyoti has definitely voiced her skepticism of carbon markets, and we share that maybe for similar or dissimilar reasons. But I think, yes, carbon sequestration, soil health measures beyond just carbon are important, but also biodiversity, et cetera. So if there are easier, more cost-effective ways, and we are getting some of those technologies, so Landsat and spatial data are correlative, and you need to ground truth that data, but we need technologies, methodologies, ways of translating reliably, directionally correct ways of practice adoption in a geography and a system to impacts at a farm and really landscape level, that then we can use them to incentivize and build rewards and make decisions based on that to get more behavior change.
Thank you. Okay, so
one
sorry,
more,
Matt.
just from a science perspective. I mean, there's so many questions, and the first one that came to my mind is we know so little about the soil, and I think that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about what happens a few inches below our feet, and I think understanding the biological indicators that might help to build soil health is going to be really important. I know there's a lot of work being done on this at the moment. I think soil science is having a bit of a moment in the sun, actually, and I think that we will start to see some breakthroughs, but again, I think understanding more about indicators for soil health is going to be really, really key as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have coming to the end. Just to conclude, I would like each of you really quickly, 30 seconds max, please, to offer either your thoughts on the difficult issue that you think is important but that we didn't discuss properly, or the thing that you have sort of gained from the discussion where you feel there is some agreement. So either of those two things, please. One's backward looking and one's I guess forward looking. So who wants to go first? Because we can take these forward into the next discussion. Melissa, you look like you're about to say something. I'm going to volunteer you.
I'll just go, and then I'm sure I'll think of 20 other things after the others have said anything, but fine, I'll go first. And they're the different sides of this same coin, actually, the insights I've gleaned, as well as what more needs to be discussed. I think on the one hand, this discussion for me with very different speakers, I hope, and hopefully for the audience, is showing that regen ag should be much more broadly and holistically defined, and is a lot more complicated than cover cropping only, and frankly, soil carbon only. And yes, soil health, that is more complicated and such a key element, but when we think of regenerative ag, we need to think of it on the deep spectrum and much more broadly, and it's complicated. And again, Matt, I'm going to really pull and say business as usual. Hearing that from Nestle, really appreciate that sentiment coming from a major corporate actor. On the other hand, what we need to do more of, and others in the chat were asking, the shared vision. I don't know that we all have to be aligned on 100% on everything. There's a continuum and a journey in this in this discussion, but on some critical basic pieces of what and how we should be defining regen ag, can we agree on that? And then what are the implications of that for decision making, for prioritization, for resource allocation, et cetera? And that where rubber hits the road will be voters on policy and elected officials to be beholden to that on the choices we make. Companies, of course, need to do their thing and make their own profit, but on the public sector, what is the minimum level we agree to for regen ag? I think we need to discuss more. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. And it actually turns out we're out of time. So maybe
Sorry.
if nobody has an absolute burning thing they want to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if you could put it in writing, and then we can feed it into next month's discussion, which is, just to remind you all, is on, I think, the 7th of February. So it just remains for me now to thank you so much for a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to interacting with you all in the next couple of weeks, and then for us reconvening on the 7th of February. And thanks very much to the audience too. So yeah, goodbye everybody.